Chief Derek Thompson charged across the federal courthouse parking lot, barked commands at two rookie officers, pushed through courthouse security, and grabbed the black woman by her arm before hurling her against his patrol car. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business," the 18-year veteran shouted, pressing his knee into her back while she calmly stated, "Chief, I am Federal Judge Diana Washington, and you need to step back immediately." The racist officer laughed until she recited his badge number, his supervisor's name, and the exact federal statute he was violating, details that only someone with supreme judicial authority would know. What Chief Thompson didn't realize was that attacking the wrong person in the wrong place would trigger consequences he never saw coming. He thought he was dealing with just another citizen who needed to be put in her place. He was wrong. What happened in the next 72 hours would change everything he thought he knew about power, authority, and the price of one moment of racist arrogance. This is the story of how one decision destroyed everything and why you'll never forget what comes next. It was 9:15 p.m. on a Wednesday evening when two vastly different worlds collided in the most catastrophic way possible outside the Theodore Levin Federal Building in Detroit, Michigan. If you believe that no one should ever face discrimination like this, type justice below. Federal Judge Diana Washington had just finished a marathon 13-hour session presiding over a complex federal corruption case. At 42, she had built her reputation as one of the most formidable jurists in the Eastern District of Michigan, renowned for her brilliant legal mind, unwavering principles, and composed authority under intense pressure. Tonight, she carried her black leather briefcase containing classified federal case documents as she walked toward her dark blue BMW in the courthouse's secured parking facility. 4 blocks away, Police Chief Derek Thompson was enduring the most challenging period of his 18-year career. Department budget slashes had created enormous pressure from City Hall, his crime clearance rates had dropped 18%, and the Civil Rights Division had received 4 formal complaints about his office's excessive enforcement methods in the previous month. At 48, Thompson took pride in being a traditional law enforcement leader, who believed in demonstrating authority first and negotiating later. Tonight, he was supervising a standard narcotics operation that had produced nothing but paperwork and irritated subordinates. The emergency call arrived at 9:12 p.m. Suspicious behavior reported near Federal Building. Multiple persons observed gathering in parking vicinity. Thompson's face hardened as he recognized the location. Federal jurisdiction meant federal bureaucracy, federal documentation, and federal complications. But a call demanded response, and Thompson never hesitated to establish his authority, regardless of territorial boundaries. Judge Washington had just approached her vehicle when she observed the concerning activity. 3 patrol units had encircled a group of young professionals near the visitor parking section. She paused, studying the scene with the trained observation of someone who had dedicated decades to the criminal justice system. Something appeared problematic about the officers' formation and their aggressive posture toward what seemed to be courthouse personnel completing their evening duties. Thompson arrived on location in his department-issued Chevrolet Tahoe, emergency beacons slicing through the humid Detroit night. He surveyed the situation with mounting frustration. His officers had detained 5 individuals, but it was obvious this operation was yielding minimal results. The suspicious persons had turned out to be federal court administrators working late on case documentation. "This is wasting valuable time," Thompson muttered to Detective Lisa Rodriguez, his newest team addition. "But we're committed now, so we're going to ensure everyone comprehends who maintains control here." Judge Washington observed Thompson's arrival and immediately recognized the dangerous escalation in atmosphere. Throughout her judicial career, she had encountered this category of law enforcement official before, the type whose pride exceeded their wisdom, whose compulsion to display dominance frequently resulted in constitutional violations. As Thompson approached the detained court personnel, Judge Washington made a decision that would alter both their destinies permanently. She secured her vehicle and advanced toward the scene, her federal judicial authority compelling her to ensure proper protocols were maintained on federal property. "Excuse me, officers," she stated in her authoritative courtroom voice, clear and commanding. I'm interested in understanding the legal basis for this detention. Thompson spun around, his expression flushed with irritation. In the dim parking area lighting, he perceived a well-dressed black woman in her 40s, carrying a briefcase challenging his authority. Every bias, every frustration, every fragment of his wounded pride crystallized into pure fury. But what Chief Thompson didn't realize was that the woman questioning his authority possessed the power to activate federal protocols that would expose everything he'd constructed over 18 years. And every moment of what happened next was being captured by courthouse security systems that never cease monitoring. To comprehend what occurred next, you must understand exactly who these two individuals were and why this particular collision was inevitable. Judge Diana Washington hadn't always worn judicial robes. 18 years earlier, she had been a civil rights lawyer in Detroit, Michigan, specializing in police misconduct litigation. She had constructed her career methodically, winning case after case against departments that considered themselves immune to accountability. Her appointment to the federal bench 4 years ago had received unanimous confirmation, an extraordinary achievement in today's polarized political environment. What made Judge Washington particularly dangerous to someone like Chief Thompson was her comprehensive mastery of federal civil rights legislation. She had memorized every statute, every legal precedent, every procedural requirement governing police interactions with citizens. More critically, she understood the federal mechanisms that could be triggered when law enforcement officers violated constitutional rights on federal property. Chief Derek Thompson represented everything Judge Washington had spent her career combating. His personnel record, if she had access to it, would have revealed a pattern that Internal Affairs had somehow overlooked for nearly 2 decades. Excessive force allegations that were mysteriously withdrawn, witness statements that suddenly became unreliable, evidence that conveniently vanished, legal settlements paid by the city that never reached newspaper coverage. Thompson had survived and flourished in the department because he understood how the system operated. He knew which supervisors to cultivate, which politicians to support, and which community leaders to charm. He had built a protection network that had allowed him to operate without accountability for 18 years. But tonight, that protection was about to encounter its nemesis. "Ma'am, this is police business," Thompson said, his voice carrying the tone of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "I'm going to need you to step back and allow us to handle this situation." Judge Washington remained perfectly motionless, her briefcase at her side, her posture radiating the quiet confidence of someone who had confronted hostile courtrooms, aggressive attorneys, and intimidating defendants without ever losing her composure. "Officer, I'm simply inquiring about the legal foundation for this detention," she replied, her voice calm but carrying an undertone that should have warned Thompson he was dealing with someone far more knowledgeable than he assumed. The other officers, Rodriguez, Jackson, and Martinez, began to sense that something was shifting. They had worked with Thompson long enough to recognize the warning signs when his temper was about to explode. But they also noticed something about this woman that made them uncomfortable. Her vocabulary, her posture, her complete lack of intimidation in the face of 4 armed officers. Everything about her suggested she wasn't who Thompson assumed she was. Thompson's expression darkened. In his mind, this was a simple equation. He was a police chief with 18 years of experience, and she was a civilian questioning his authority on the street. The fact that she was a black woman made it even more infuriating to him. In Thompson's worldview, there was a natural hierarchy, and people needed to stay in their designated places. "Ma'am, I'm not going to ask you again," Thompson said, stepping closer to Judge Washington. "You need to move along right now, or you're going to find yourself in handcuffs." The court employees who had been detained were now watching this new confrontation with growing alarm. They recognized Judge Washington. She was one of the most senior judges in the building, but they were too far away to intervene or warn the officers about their catastrophic mistake. But he didn't know that this routine evening would expose a pattern that had been concealed for decades. Because Judge Washington wasn't just any federal judge, she was the one judge in the district with the authority to trigger immediate federal oversight of any law enforcement agency, and she had been quietly documenting patterns of police misconduct for years. Judge Washington looked directly at Thompson's badge, noting his number, 3947. She observed his name tag, D. Thompson. She mentally catalogued the badge numbers of the other three officers. In federal court, details mattered, and Judge Washington never forgot a detail. "Chief Thompson," she said, using his rank and name with precision, "I believe there may be some confusion about jurisdiction here. This is federal property, and these appear to be federal employees." The use of his name and rank should have been Thompson's first warning. Civilians didn't typically know how to read police insignia or identify ranking officers, but Thompson was too angry to notice the warning signs. What happened next would be replayed on news networks across the country, analyzed by legal experts, and studied in police academies as an example of how a single moment of poor judgment can destroy everything. Thompson was now standing less than 3 feet from Judge Washington, his face flushed with anger, his hands clenched at his sides. 18 years of unquestioned authority had conditioned him to expect immediate compliance when he raised his voice. The fact that this woman remained calm and continued to challenge him was driving him toward a rage that would prove catastrophic. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are," Thompson snarled, "but you're about to learn that when I give an order, you follow it. I don't care if you think you're some kind of lawyer or whatever." "Chief Thompson," Judge Washington interrupted, her voice still controlled, but now carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to controlling courtrooms filled with hostile attorneys and dangerous defendants. "I am Federal Judge Diana Washington of the Eastern District of Michigan, and you are currently violating Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 242, which prohibits the deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law." The words hit the other 3 officers like a physical blow. Detective Rodriguez actually took a step backward. Officer Jackson's hand moved instinctively away from his weapon. Officer Martinez looked around nervously, suddenly aware of the federal courthouse security cameras that were undoubtedly recording every moment of this interaction. But Chief Thompson, his vision clouded by rage and wounded pride, heard only one thing: a black woman telling him what he could and couldn't do. "I don't care if you're the Queen of England," Thompson shouted, spittle flying from his lips. "You're interfering with police business, and you're going to learn some respect." Judge Washington remained motionless, but her mind was working with the precision of a judicial computer. She was mentally cataloging every violation of procedure, every constitutional transgression, every federal statute that was being broken in real time. More importantly, she was acutely aware that everything happening was being recorded by multiple federal security systems that would preserve this evidence forever. The transformation in the other officers was visible. They had gone from confident law enforcement professionals to men who suddenly realized they might be witnessing the end of their careers. Detective Rodriguez, who had only been with the department for 6 months, looked like she was about to be sick. "Chief," Rodriguez said quietly, "maybe we should—" "Shut up, Rodriguez," Thompson snapped. "This woman thinks she can come down here and tell us how to do our jobs. She's about to learn different." Judge Washington could see the trajectory of what was about to happen. She had spent decades in courtrooms, watching people make decisions that would destroy their lives. She had seen defendants confess to crimes they didn't commit, attorneys sabotage their own cases, and prosecutors overreach in ways that invalidated years of investigation. But she had never seen someone about to commit professional suicide so completely, and with such determination. "Chief Thompson," she said, making one final attempt to prevent the catastrophe she could see coming, "I strongly advise you to contact your supervisor before this situation escalates further." Thompson heard those words as the ultimate challenge to his authority. In his twisted logic, backing down now would represent a defeat that he could never recover from. The other officers were watching. The federal courthouse was in the background. This woman was questioning not just his judgment, but his very right to wear the badge. He made his decision. Thompson stepped forward, grabbed Judge Washington by her left arm, and shoved her backward against his patrol car with enough force to make her briefcase fall to the ground, scattering legal documents across the asphalt. "You're under arrest for interfering with police business," he shouted, pressing his knee into her back while reaching for his handcuffs. The sound of Judge Washington's briefcase hitting the ground echoed across the parking lot like a gunshot. Federal case files scattered in the humid Detroit breeze. And in that moment, Chief Derek Thompson crossed a line that would trigger consequences he couldn't even imagine. When the other officers realized who Chief Thompson had just attacked, their faces went pale. Because attacking a federal judge isn't just assault. It's a federal crime that automatically triggers FBI involvement, and there's no going back. Detective Rodriguez was the first to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. As Judge Washington's federal case files scattered across the parking lot, she could see the official seals, the federal court headers, the classified markings that indicated these weren't just any legal documents. "Chief," Rodriguez said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Chief, I think—" But Thompson was beyond listening. He had Judge Washington pressed against his patrol car, her hands behind her back, completely convinced that he was teaching a valuable lesson about respecting police authority. In his adrenaline-fueled state, he couldn't hear the horror in his officers' voices or see the federal courthouse security guards who were now moving rapidly toward their location. Judge Washington, even with her face pressed against the cold metal of the police car, remained completely calm. Her years on the federal bench had taught her that panic was the enemy of justice, and that dignity under pressure was often the most powerful weapon against tyranny. "Chief Thompson," she said, her voice muffled but still clear, "badge number 3947. Your supervisor is Deputy Chief Maria Santos, extension 6621. The federal statute you are currently violating carries a maximum penalty of 12 years in federal prison." The specificity of her knowledge hit the other officers like a lightning bolt. Civilians didn't know badge numbers, supervisory chains of command, or federal sentencing guidelines. Only someone with intimate knowledge of law enforcement procedures would have access to that kind of detailed information. Officer Jackson, a 12-year veteran, felt his stomach drop as the pieces began falling into place. The briefcase full of federal documents, the perfect legal terminology, the complete lack of fear in the face of armed officers. The way she carried herself with absolute authority, even while being physically restrained. "Oh my God," Jackson whispered to Martinez. "She's really a federal judge." Martinez, who had been filming the interaction on his body camera as per department protocol, suddenly realized that he was recording what might be the most catastrophic law enforcement failure in Michigan history. His hands began shaking as he understood that this footage would likely be evidence in a federal criminal trial. Thompson, still pressing his knee into Judge Washington's back, finally heard something that penetrated his rage-clouded consciousness. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching at high speed with emergency lights activated. Federal courthouse security had been monitoring the situation from the moment it began. The Federal Protective Service, which provides security for all federal buildings and personnel, had protocols for exactly this type of situation. When a federal judge's safety was threatened, those protocols were activated automatically and without discussion. 3 black SUVs with federal plates surrounded the scene in less than 90 seconds. Federal agents in tactical gear emerged with weapons drawn, not pointing them at anyone, but making it clear that this situation had just escalated to a level that local police couldn't control. "Federal agents," announced Supervisory Special Agent Carlos Ramirez from the U.S. Marshals Service, "release the individual immediately and step away from the vehicle." Thompson looked up to see half a dozen federal agents surrounding him, their presence transforming what he had thought was a routine arrest into something that looked like a scene from a movie. For the first time since this encounter began, doubt crept into his consciousness. "This woman was interfering with—" Thompson began. "Sir," Agent Ramirez interrupted, his voice carrying absolute authority, "that woman is Federal Judge Diana Washington. You need to remove your hands from her immediately and step back." The words "Federal Judge Diana Washington" hit Thompson like a physical blow. He had heard that name before. Every law enforcement officer in Michigan knew that name. She was the judge who had sent corrupt cops to federal prison. She was the judge who had overseen the landmark civil rights cases that had reformed 3 different police departments. She was the judge who had the power to place entire law enforcement agencies under federal oversight. Thompson's hands fell away from Judge Washington as if he had been electrocuted. The handcuffs he had been reaching for clattered to the ground. His face went from flushed red to ash white in the span of 3 seconds. Judge Washington straightened her jacket, picked up her scattered legal documents with the help of Detective Rodriguez, and turned to face Thompson with the calm dignity of someone who had just proven a point about power, authority, and the consequences of prejudice. But what happened in the next 15 minutes would change everything. What happened next would trigger an investigation that would expose corruption reaching the highest levels of the department. Because what Chief Thompson didn't know was that assaulting a federal judge doesn't just end careers. It triggers federal protocols that can't be stopped, can't be covered up, and can't be ignored. And the evidence they were about to uncover would prove that this wasn't his first time. Within 6 minutes of Agent Ramirez identifying Judge Washington, a series of federal protocols began activating that would ultimately involve 4 different federal agencies: the U.S. Attorney's Office and the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. Federal Protective Service Protocol, FPS 3947, required immediate notification of any threat to federal judicial personnel. U.S. Marshal Service Protocol USMS 2847 mandated full investigation of any physical assault on a federal judge. FBI Protocol FBI CR 3947 triggered automatic civil rights violation review for any use of force against federal officials by local law enforcement. Chief Thompson stood frozen as he watched his career disintegrating in real time. Judge Washington, now surrounded by federal agents who treated her with the deference due to her position, began the process that would ultimately lead to his destruction. "Agent Ramirez," Judge Washington said, her voice returning to its normal judicial tone, "I'll need incident report number FBI 3947 DET to be filed within the hour. Chief Thompson violated 18 U.S.C. 242, 18 U.S.C. 245, and potentially 42 U.S.C. 1983. I'll also need the video evidence secured from courthouse cameras 9, 14, and 17, which have overlapping coverage of this entire incident." Thompson watched in growing horror as Judge Washington demonstrated exactly how much power she wielded. She wasn't just reciting law, she was activating a federal machinery that he didn't even know existed. Every protocol she mentioned would generate reports that would be read by federal prosecutors. Every camera she referenced would provide evidence that couldn't be suppressed or destroyed. Detective Rodriguez approached her chief with obvious reluctance. "Chief, we should probably contact Deputy Chief Santos right away." Thompson nodded numbly, finally understanding that this situation was completely beyond his control. But what he didn't know was that Deputy Chief Santos had already been contacted, not by Thompson's team but by the Federal Protective Service, who had notification protocols that bypassed local command structures entirely. Santos's phone had been ringing for 3 minutes when Thompson finally called. "Santos here. Deputy Chief, this is Chief Thompson. We have a situation at the federal courthouse that—" "Thompson," Santos interrupted, her voice tight with barely controlled panic, "please tell me you did not just assault Federal Judge Diana Washington." The silence on Thompson's end told Santos everything she needed to know. "Thompson, where are you right now?" "I'm at the courthouse with federal agents and—" "Do not say another word over this radio channel," Santos snapped. "I'm en route with legal counsel. Do not speak to anyone, do not make any statements, and do not leave the scene until I arrive." But Santos knew it was already too late. Federal assault charges against police officers weren't handled by local prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate. They were handled by the U.S. Attorney's Office, where Judge Washington had personal relationships with every prosecutor, and where Thompson's 18-year career meant absolutely nothing. Judge Washington was now speaking quietly with Agent Ramirez, providing a detailed account of the incident that would become the foundation for federal charges. Her memory for detail was legendary in legal circles. She could recall conversations verbatim years after they occurred, and her credibility with federal prosecutors was absolute. "Agent Ramirez, you should know that Chief Thompson displayed a pattern of behavior that suggests this wasn't an isolated incident," Judge Washington said. "His immediate assumption that I was just another civilian who needed to be taught respect indicates systematic bias training issues within the department." Those words, systematic bias and training issues, were federal code for the kind of investigation that could place entire police departments under federal oversight. Thompson, standing 20 feet away, could hear enough of the conversation to understand that Judge Washington wasn't just filing charges against him personally, she was triggering a comprehensive review of his entire department. Officer Martinez was still recording everything on his body camera, but now he understood that this footage wouldn't just be evidence in Thompson's case, it would be evidence in a federal pattern and practice investigation that could last for years and result in court-ordered reforms for the entire police force. The other officers, Rodriguez, Jackson, and Martinez, were beginning to realize that their own careers might be in jeopardy simply for being present during this catastrophic incident. Federal investigators would interview them separately, review their individual records, and determine whether they had enabled or participated in Thompson's pattern of misconduct. But what they didn't realize was that everything was being recorded, not just by courthouse security, but by federal surveillance systems that capture every interaction on federal property, and these recordings can never be deleted or suppressed. The evidence they found left everyone in shock. Deputy Chief Maria Santos arrived at the federal courthouse with the department's legal counsel, Attorney Jennifer Blake, expecting to manage a relatively routine excessive force complaint. What they found instead was a federal crime scene with evidence technicians photographing skid marks on the pavement and agents collecting Judge Washington's scattered legal documents as evidence. Santos had known Thompson for 12 years. They had come up through the ranks together, covered for each other during internal affairs investigations, and shared an understanding about how to manage problematic complaints from the community. But seeing Thompson standing next to his patrol car with federal agents documenting every inch of the scene, Santos realized that their network of protection was about to be tested like never before. Chief Thompson, Santos said carefully, aware that federal agents were recording every word, you are relieved of duty pending investigation. Blake will handle all communications from this point forward. Attorney Blake was sweating despite the cool evening air. She specialized in police misconduct defense, but her experience was entirely with local prosecutors who might be willing to negotiate. Federal charges were a completely different world, a world where political considerations and professional relationships meant nothing, and where the evidence either supported charges or it didn't. Your Honor, Blake approached Judge Washington with obvious reluctance. I'm Jennifer Blake representing Chief Thompson. I was hoping we might discuss Ms. Blake, Judge Washington interrupted. This is now a federal criminal matter. Any communications should go through the U.S. Attorney's Office. Blake's face went pale. Federal criminal matter meant FBI investigation, federal grand jury, and potential federal prison time. It meant that Thompson's case would be handled by federal prosecutors who specialized in civil rights violations and who viewed police misconduct as a priority area for prosecution. Agent Ramirez was now coordinating with FBI Special Agent David Harris, who had just arrived from the Detroit field office with a mobile forensic unit. The FBI's involvement meant that this case would receive the full resources of federal law enforcement, resources that could uncover patterns of misconduct going back decades. Agent Harris, Judge Washington said, I believe you'll want to review Chief Thompson's entire disciplinary record as part of your investigation. Based on his behavior tonight, I suspect you'll find a pattern of constitutional violations that his department has failed to address. Agent Harris nodded, making notes that would trigger subpoenas for Thompson's personnel file, internal affairs records, and every complaint filed against him in his 18-year career. Federal investigators had access to records that local oversight agencies often ignored or suppressed. Thompson watched this conversation with growing desperation. He could see his entire life being systematically dismantled by federal agents who operated with resources and authority that local investigators couldn't match. Every complaint he thought had been buried, every witness who had been intimidated into silence, every piece of evidence that had mysteriously disappeared, all of it would be reviewed by federal agents who couldn't be influenced by local politics. Santos was now coordinating with Police Commissioner Robert Hayes, who had been awakened at home and informed that one of his chiefs had assaulted a federal judge. Hayes understood immediately that this incident would trigger federal oversight of his entire department, oversight that could result in court-ordered reforms, federal monitoring, and budget restrictions that would last for years. "Santos," Hayes said over the phone, "I need a complete timeline of every complaint against Thompson for the past 5 years. I need it by morning, and I need it to be comprehensive. The FBI is going to request it anyway, and I want to know what they're going to find before they find it." But Santos knew that compiling Thompson's complete record would be like documenting a pattern of misconduct that the department had systematically ignored. Every complaint that had been dismissed, every witness interview that had been perfunctory, every internal investigation that had concluded with insufficient evidence, all of it would now be reviewed by federal agents who understood exactly how local departments protected problematic officers. Judge Washington was completing her statement to Agent Harris, providing details that would form the foundation for federal charges. Her account was precise, comprehensive, and devastating, exactly what federal prosecutors needed to build an unbeatable case. "Comment your country and city. Let's see where justice is being celebrated." "Agent Harris," Judge Washington concluded, "I want to emphasize that Chief Thompson's actions tonight were not the result of poor judgment or inadequate training. They were the result of systematic bias and a belief that his authority superseded federal law. That kind of mentality doesn't develop in isolation. It develops in departments that enable and protect it. The department thought they could contain this, but they had no idea how deep the corruption went. Because Judge Washington had been quietly documenting patterns of police misconduct for years, and she had been waiting for the right moment to act. No one expected the investigation to reveal this. By 11:30 p.m., less than 3 hours after Thompson had first grabbed Judge Washington's arm, federal prosecutors at the U.S. Attorney's Office were already reviewing preliminary evidence and preparing federal charges that would be filed within 48 hours. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Davis was the Civil Rights Division's specialist in police misconduct cases. He had successfully prosecuted 52 law enforcement officers for federal civil rights violations in his 14-year career. When his phone rang at 11:15 p.m. with news that a police chief had assaulted federal judge Diana Washington, Davis knew this would be the highest-profile case of his career. "Judge Washington," Davis said when he called her at home, "I've reviewed the preliminary FBI report. We'll be filing federal charges under 18 U.S.C. 242 and 18 U.S.C. 245. Given your status as a federal judge and the clear evidence of bias motivation, we'll be recommending the maximum penalty range." Section 18 U.S.C. 242 was the federal civil rights statute that prohibited deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law. 18 U.S.C. 245 was the federal hate crime statute that enhanced penalties when victims were targeted because of their race. Combined, these charges carried a maximum sentence of 17 years in federal prison. Judge Washington understood the significance of Davis's call. Federal prosecutors didn't call victims to discuss charging decisions unless they were completely confident in their ability to secure convictions. Davis was calling because he wanted Judge Washington to know that Thompson would face the full weight of federal justice. Meanwhile, at FBI headquarters in Detroit, Special Agent Harris was compiling Thompson's 18-year record of complaints, lawsuits, and disciplinary actions. What he discovered was a pattern of misconduct so comprehensive that it suggested systematic failure by the police department's oversight mechanisms. 37 complaints of excessive force, 22 allegations of racial bias, 12 lawsuits settled by the city with confidential agreements, 5 internal affairs investigations that concluded with insufficient evidence despite compelling witness testimony. A pattern of behavior that should have resulted in termination years ago, but had instead been enabled and protected by supervisors who valued loyalty over accountability. Agent Harris's report would ultimately trigger a federal pattern and practice investigation under 42 U.S.C. 14141, which would place the entire police department under federal oversight and mandate comprehensive reforms that would cost millions of dollars and take years to implement. Thompson, meanwhile, was at home in his suburban colonial house, staring at his police academy graduation photo and trying to understand how 18 years of what he considered successful law enforcement had led to this moment. His wife Carol was crying quietly in their bedroom, already understanding that their middle-class lifestyle, their children's college funds, and their retirement plans had been destroyed by one moment of racist arrogance. Thompson's phone had been ringing constantly since word of the incident spread through the department. Fellow officers, supervisors, and union representatives all wanted to know what had happened and how bad the damage would be. But Thompson couldn't explain how he had confused a federal judge for a random civilian, couldn't justify why he had used force against someone who had never threatened him, and couldn't rationalize why he had ignored every warning sign that should have told him to stop. The police union's attorney, Mark Rodriguez, had reviewed the preliminary evidence and delivered news that shattered Thompson's last hope. "Derek, this isn't a case we can defend. The evidence is overwhelming. The victim is a federal judge and the FBI has video of everything. My advice is to negotiate for the minimum sentence and hope the federal prosecutors are feeling generous." But federal prosecutors rarely felt generous when police officers violated the civil rights of federal judges. The U.S. Attorney's Office had a reputation to maintain, and prosecuting corrupt cops was always popular with voters and civil rights organizations. Commissioner Hayes was now meeting with the mayor, the city attorney, and federal mediators to discuss the terms of federal oversight that would be imposed on the department. The incident with Judge Washington had accelerated investigations that had been building for years, and the city was facing federal intervention that would reshape every aspect of police operations. "Commissioner," Mayor Patricia Anderson said, her voice tight with controlled anger, "I need to know how many more Derek Thompsons we have in this department, and I need to know how we're going to prevent this from happening again." Hayes knew the answer would be devastating. The department had dozens of officers with complaint patterns similar to Thompson's, and preventing future incidents would require systemic changes that the department had resisted for decades. What the federal investigation uncovered would shock the entire nation, because Chief Thompson's 18-year career wasn't built on good police work. It was built on intimidation, cover-ups, and a department that protected him at every turn. What the FBI discovered was much worse than they imagined. Federal investigators had been working for 20 hours straight when they uncovered evidence that transformed Thompson's case from a single incident of misconduct into a federal conspiracy investigation involving multiple officers and supervisors. FBI agent Harris had been analyzing Thompson's personnel file when he noticed a pattern that made his stomach turn. Every single complaint against Thompson had been investigated by the same internal affairs detective, Lieutenant Carlos Garcia. Every single investigation had concluded with insufficient evidence. Every single witness had mysteriously become unavailable or unreliable during the investigation process. Garcia had been protecting Thompson for 13 years, and their arrangement had generated millions of dollars in legal settlements that the city had paid to avoid federal scrutiny. Harris's discovery meant that Garcia would also face federal charges for conspiracy to violate civil rights under 18 U.S.C. 241. The evidence was overwhelming. Email records showed Garcia had coached Thompson on how to write incident reports that would withstand scrutiny. Phone records revealed coordination between Garcia and Thompson before internal affairs interviews. Financial records indicated that Thompson had helped Garcia obtain a promotion by providing false testimony in another officer's disciplinary hearing. At 2:30 a.m., federal agents arrested Lieutenant Garcia at his home in Troy, Michigan. The arrest warrant was based on evidence that Garcia had systematically suppressed investigations into Thompson's misconduct for over a decade. Garcia's arrest meant that other officers who had participated in the cover-up network would also face federal charges. Judge Washington had been monitoring the investigation's progress through regular updates from the U.S. Attorney's Office. Each new revelation confirmed her understanding that Thompson's behavior represented institutional failure, not individual misconduct. Assistant U.S. Attorney Davis, Judge Washington said during their morning phone call, "I want to ensure that this investigation addresses the systemic issues that enabled Chief Thompson's behavior for 18 years. Individual prosecution is important, but institutional reform is essential. Davis understood that Judge Washington was positioning this case as a catalyst for comprehensive police reform. Her influence with federal oversight agencies would ensure that Thompson's prosecution led to long-term changes in police accountability throughout Michigan. The local news media had picked up the story by morning, but they completely misunderstood its significance. Local reporters focused on Thompson's arrest and the assault charges, missing the larger story of federal investigation into systematic police corruption. But national news organizations understood exactly what was happening. CNN's justice correspondent reported that the Thompson case was likely to trigger the most comprehensive federal investigation of police misconduct in Michigan since the 1970s. The Washington Post's civil rights reporter described it as a textbook example of how individual incidents can expose institutional failures. Thompson woke up in his suburban bedroom to discover that his name was trending on Twitter. His photograph was being shown on national television, and civil rights organizations were using his case as an example of everything wrong with American policing. Benjamin Crump, the renowned civil rights attorney, issued a statement that captured the national significance. Chief Thompson's assault on Judge Washington represents the collision between America's legacy of racial oppression and the constitutional authority that protects our democracy. When police officers believe they can assault federal judges with impunity, our entire system of justice is under attack. Thompson's defense attorney, Jennifer Blake, was struggling to find any viable defense strategy. Federal civil rights cases were notoriously difficult to defend because they focused on clear constitutional violations rather than complex legal interpretations. The evidence against Thompson was captured on multiple cameras, witnessed by federal agents, and documented by one of the most respected judges in the federal system. "Derek," Blake said during their morning meeting, "the federal prosecutors are offering a plea agreement, 9 years in federal prison in exchange for cooperation in the investigation of Lieutenant Garcia and other officers. It's the best deal you're going to get." Thompson stared at the plea agreement that would destroy everything he had built over 18 years. 9 years in federal prison meant losing his pension, his benefits, and any hope of future employment in law enforcement. But fighting the charges meant risking the maximum sentence of 17 years, and Blake had made it clear that winning at trial was virtually impossible. The investigation was expanding beyond Thompson and Garcia to include other officers who had participated in the cover-up network. Federal agents were reviewing every case Thompson had worked, every arrest he had made, and every incident report he had filed. Dozens of cases were being overturned as evidence of Thompson's pattern of misconduct came to light. Detective Rodriguez, the rookie who had witnessed Thompson's assault on Judge Washington, had become a federal whistleblower whose testimony was helping investigators understand the full scope of departmental corruption. Her cooperation agreement included federal witness protection and relocation assistance, recognition that testifying against corrupt colleagues had made her a target for retaliation. The psychological impact on Thompson was becoming increasingly evident during his court appearances. The man who had spent 18 years believing he was untouchable now faced the reality that his entire identity as a law enforcement officer had been built on systematic violations of the law he was supposed to protect. Prison psychiatrists would later document severe depression and anxiety disorders that developed as Thompson confronted the magnitude of his crimes and their consequences. Meanwhile, Judge Washington was working with federal oversight agencies to implement comprehensive reforms that would prevent future Derek Thompsons from operating with impunity. Her recommendations included mandatory body cameras for all officers, independent oversight of excessive force complaints, federal review of all use of force incidents, and automatic termination for officers with documented patterns of misconduct. The financial cost of Thompson's crimes was mounting exponentially. The city faced millions of dollars in federal oversight expenses, civil rights settlements, and reform implementation costs. Insurance companies were threatening to cancel coverage for the police department unless comprehensive accountability measures were implemented immediately. Federal prosecutors were also pursuing civil asset forfeiture against Thompson's property, arguing that his house and savings had been purchased with income from his corrupt law enforcement career. The forfeiture action meant that even if Thompson somehow managed to avoid prison time, he would lose everything he had accumulated over 18 years of what prosecutors characterized as systematic criminal activity under color of law. The ripple effects of Thompson's assault on Judge Washington were being felt throughout law enforcement agencies across Michigan. Police chiefs were conducting emergency reviews of their own department's disciplinary records, desperately trying to identify potential problems before federal investigators arrived at their doors. The Michigan State Police had launched its own investigation into how Thompson's pattern of misconduct had remained undetected for so long. Their preliminary findings suggested that similar corruption networks existed in departments throughout the state, protected by the same culture of silence and loyalty that had enabled Thompson's crimes. Judge Washington's influence on the case extended far beyond the immediate prosecution. She was consulting with the Department of Justice on new federal guidelines for investigating police misconduct, drawing on her experience to develop protocols that would make it easier to identify and prosecute corrupt officers before their behavior escalated to Thompson's level. The national civil rights community was watching Thompson's case as a test of federal commitment to police accountability. Organizations like the NAACP, the American Civil Liberties Union, and the Southern Poverty Law Center had filed amicus briefs supporting maximum sentences and comprehensive reforms that would prevent similar incidents in the future. Thompson's former colleagues were distancing themselves from him as quickly as possible, understanding that association with his crimes could destroy their own careers. Officers who had once considered Thompson a mentor and role model were now cooperating with federal investigators, providing evidence of misconduct they had previously ignored or enabled. The transformation of Thompson from respected police chief to federal defendant was being studied by criminologists and police reform advocates as an example of how institutional corruption could be exposed and dismantled through federal intervention. His case was becoming required reading in police academies and law schools across the country, but the consequences were only beginning. Because losing his job was just the start. Chief Thompson was about to face federal criminal charges that carried a minimum of 10 years in prison, and Judge Washington had one final move that would ensure he could never hurt anyone again. When the federal marshals arrived, he learned that it was over. The federal pattern and practice investigation triggered by Thompson's assault had uncovered evidence of corruption so extensive that the Department of Justice placed the entire police force under federal oversight, only the fourth time in U.S. history that such drastic action had been taken. Federal Monitor Dr. Sarah Martinez, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in police reform, was appointed to oversee comprehensive changes that would reshape every aspect of law enforcement operations. Her mandate included complete restructuring of internal affairs, implementation of community oversight mechanisms, and federal review of all hiring and promotion decisions. The evidence uncovered in the Thompson investigation reveals institutional failure at every level, Dr. Martinez announced at her first public meeting. This department has systematically protected officers who violated citizens' constitutional rights, while retaliating against officers who attempted to report misconduct. The financial cost of federal oversight was staggering. The city was required to pay for Dr. Martinez's team of federal monitors, implement new training programs for all officers, upgrade technology systems to ensure accountability, and settle hundreds of civil rights lawsuits that had been filed as the scope of departmental corruption became clear. Mayor Patricia Anderson faced a budget crisis that threatened city services as millions of dollars were redirected to comply with federal oversight requirements. The political consequences were swift. 3 city council members who had supported the police department's resistance to reform were recalled by voters who demanded accountability. Judge Washington was appointed to the Federal Advisory Committee on Police Reform, a position that gave her national influence over law enforcement accountability policies. Her experience with the Thompson case made her a leading expert on how federal oversight could transform corrupt police departments. The Thompson case proves that individual prosecution must be combined with institutional reform, Judge Washington testified before Congress. We cannot simply arrest corrupt officers. We must dismantle the systems that protect and enable their corruption. Her congressional testimony led to the Federal Police Accountability Act, legislation that would require all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to implement oversight mechanisms similar to those developed in response to Thompson's crimes. Thompson's former colleagues were cooperating with federal investigators in exchange for reduced sentences, providing evidence of corruption that reached the highest levels of city government. The investigation expanded to include city council members who had blocked police reform, prosecutors who had refused to file charges against problem officers, and judges who had dismissed cases based on prosecutorial pressure rather than evidence. Detective Rodriguez, who had been promoted to sergeant as recognition for her courage in exposing departmental corruption, testified before the Senate Judiciary Committee about the culture of fear that had prevented officers from reporting misconduct for decades. Thompson and Garcia created an atmosphere where good officers knew that reporting misconduct would end their careers, Rodriguez testified. The federal investigation gave us the protection we needed to tell the truth about what was really happening in our department. The police union that had initially defended Thompson was forced to implement new policies prohibiting the defense of officers charged with federal civil rights violations. Union leadership was replaced by reformers who committed to supporting accountability rather than impunity. Federal oversight was producing measurable results within 6 months. Excessive force complaints dropped by 71%, citizen satisfaction with police services increased by 52%, and federal prosecutors reported a significant reduction in civil rights violations by law enforcement officers. But the human cost of Thompson's crimes continued to mount. Families who had been victimized by Thompson during his 18-year career were filing civil rights lawsuits, seeking millions of dollars in damages. Each lawsuit provided additional evidence of the systematic failure that had enabled Thompson's behavior. Maria Rodriguez, whose teenage son had been brutalized by Thompson 2 years earlier, testified at federal hearings about the long-term impact of police misconduct. "My son still has nightmares about what Chief Thompson did to him. But knowing that Thompson will never hurt another family gives us some peace." The transformation was not without resistance. Police officers who had benefited from the old system of impunity organized protests against federal oversight, claiming that accountability measures were making law enforcement impossible. But community support for reform was overwhelming, and political leaders who opposed federal oversight were voted out of office. Thompson's personal destruction was accelerating as federal investigators uncovered evidence of financial crimes connected to his abuse of office. Bank records showed suspicious deposits that coincided with dismissed internal affairs investigations. Property records revealed real estate purchases that exceeded his official salary. Tax records indicated unreported income from sources that investigators were still trying to identify. The psychological toll on Thompson's family was becoming increasingly apparent. His wife Carol had filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order after Thompson's drinking escalated to dangerous levels. Their children had changed schools to escape the stigma of their father's crimes, and family members were receiving death threats from community members who had been victimized by Thompson's misconduct. Thompson himself was declining rapidly under the pressure of federal investigation. Court observers noted significant weight loss, trembling hands during hearings, and periods of apparent confusion that suggested severe psychological distress. His defense attorney requested psychiatric evaluation to determine whether Thompson was competent to stand trial. The changes were revolutionary, but Chief Thompson's personal reckoning was still coming, because Judge Washington had one final move that would ensure he could never hurt anyone again. The sentence he received shattered everything. On a cold morning in February, 8 months after he had assaulted Judge Washington, Derek Thompson stood before federal Judge Thomas Bradley to receive a sentence that would destroy what remained of his life. The federal courthouse was packed with civil rights activists, victims of Thompson's abuse, and journalists covering what had become the most significant police accountability case in Michigan history. Judge Washington sat in the front row, a visible reminder of the dignity and authority that Thompson had tried to violate. Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Davis presented evidence that painted Thompson as the centerpiece of a corrupt network that had victimized hundreds of citizens over 2 decades. The sentencing memorandum included victim impact statements from 52 people who had been brutalized, falsely arrested, or intimidated by Thompson and his confederates. "Your Honor," Davis said, "Derek Thompson used his badge and gun to terrorize citizens who couldn't fight back. He believed that his uniform made him untouchable, that his authority superseded the Constitution, and that his victims were powerless to hold him accountable. He was wrong on every count." Thompson's defense attorney made a final, desperate plea for leniency, arguing that Thompson had been a product of systemic problems rather than individual malice. But federal Judge Bradley had reviewed 18 years of evidence, showing that Thompson had been the architect of the corruption, not its victim. "Mr. Thompson," Judge Bradley said, his voice carrying the weight of federal authority, "you have been convicted of crimes that strike at the foundation of our democratic system. Police officers who violate citizens' constitutional rights are not law enforcement. They are criminals who happen to wear badges." The sentence was devastating. 14 years in federal prison, 3 years of supervised release, forfeiture of all assets obtained through corrupt activities, and permanent prohibition from any law enforcement employment. Thompson would serve his time in federal facilities designed for corrupt government officials, where his fellow inmates would include other police officers, politicians, and public servants who had betrayed their oaths. Judge Washington watched Thompson's sentencing with the satisfaction of someone who had seen justice delivered through proper constitutional processes. But her focus was already shifting to the systemic changes that would prevent future Derek Thompsons from operating with impunity. "This sentence sends a clear message," Judge Washington told reporters after the hearing. "No one is above the law, not police officers, not public officials, and certainly not those who use their authority to violate the rights they swore to protect." Thompson's personal destruction was complete. His wife had divorced him and moved to another state with their children. His house had been seized through federal forfeiture proceedings. His police pension had been terminated. His law enforcement certification had been permanently revoked. Friends and family members had distanced themselves from him to avoid association with his crimes. The psychological impact was evident as Thompson was led away in shackles. The man who had spent 18 years believing he was untouchable now faced 14 years in federal prison, where his status as a corrupt police officer would make him a target for violence from inmates who had been victimized by law enforcement. Lieutenant Garcia received 12 years in federal prison for his role in covering up Thompson's crimes. Deputy Chief Santos received 10 years for participating in the conspiracy. 19 other officers received sentences ranging from probation to 7 years in prison for their roles in the corruption network. The federal investigation had ultimately resulted in the prosecution of 25 law enforcement officers, the largest police corruption case in Michigan history. The financial cost to the city exceeded $75 million in federal oversight expenses, civil rights settlements, and reform implementation. Judge Washington's role in exposing this corruption earned her national recognition as a champion of police accountability. She received the Civil Rights Award from the NAACP, the Justice Award from the American Civil Liberties Union, and was featured on the cover of Time magazine as one of the most influential people fighting government corruption. But for Judge Washington, the real victory was not the awards or recognition. It was the knowledge that systematic reforms would protect future victims from experiencing what she had endured in that courthouse parking lot. The federal monitoring of the police department would continue for 7 years, ensuring that the changes were permanent rather than temporary. New officers were trained in constitutional law and civil rights. Supervisors were held accountable for their subordinates' behavior. Community oversight provided external accountability that prevented the return of corrupt practices. Thompson's case had become a template for federal intervention in corrupt law enforcement agencies. The Department of Justice used the precedent to place 14 additional police departments under federal oversight, applying the same comprehensive reforms that had transformed Thompson's department. The financial settlements with Thompson's victims totaled over $45 million, paid by the city through insurance policies that had become prohibitively expensive as a result of the systematic misconduct. The insurance crisis forced additional reforms as companies refused to cover law enforcement agencies without comprehensive accountability measures. Maria Rodriguez, whose son had been brutalized by Thompson, spoke at community meetings about the transformation. Judge Washington showed us that dignity and courage can overcome hatred and corruption. Because of her strength, my son will grow up in a world where police officers know they will be held accountable for their actions. But the most powerful moment was yet to come, because Judge Washington's response to this assault would inspire federal legislation that would change police accountability forever. The consequences went beyond all expectations. 1 year after Derek Thompson's assault had triggered the largest police reform in Michigan history, Judge Washington stood before the United States Senate Judiciary Committee to testify about legislation that would transform police accountability nationwide. The Federal Police Accountability Act, inspired directly by the Thompson case, would require all law enforcement agencies receiving federal funding to implement oversight mechanisms, body camera requirements, and independent investigation procedures for excessive force complaints. The legislation represented the most comprehensive police reform in American history. Senators, Judge Washington testified, Derek Thompson's assault on my dignity was also an assault on the constitutional principles that govern our democracy. But his crime became an opportunity to demonstrate that our system of justice, when properly applied, can hold even the most powerful accountable and protect even the most vulnerable. The committee room was silent as Judge Washington described the systematic corruption that had protected Thompson for 18 years and the federal intervention that had finally brought justice. Her testimony was broadcast live on national television, watched by millions of Americans who understood they were witnessing a historic moment in civil rights. Senator Elizabeth Warren asked the question that captured the national significance. Judge Washington, what would have happened if you had been an ordinary citizen rather than a federal judge when Chief Thompson assaulted you? Judge Washington's answer was devastating in its simplicity. Senator, Derek Thompson had assaulted ordinary citizens for 18 years without facing any consequences. The only difference was that I had the authority to trigger federal intervention and the knowledge to ensure that intervention was effective. That exchange became the defining moment of the hearings, crystallizing public understanding that police accountability required external oversight rather than internal investigation. The Federal Police Accountability Act passed the Senate by a vote of 82-18 with bipartisan support that reflected national consensus on the need for reform. President Biden signed the legislation into law 6 months later, with Judge Washington standing beside him as he used multiple pens to ensure that pieces of the signing could be distributed to civil rights organizations across the country. This law ensures that what happened to Judge Washington and what Derek Thompson did to hundreds of victims over 18 years can never again receive institutional protection, President Biden said at the signing ceremony. The Thompson case had become a template for federal intervention in corrupt law enforcement agencies. The Department of Justice used the precedent to place 16 additional police departments under federal oversight, applying the same comprehensive reforms that had transformed Thompson's department. Derek Thompson was serving his federal sentence at the Federal Correctional Institution in Coleman, Florida, a medium-security facility that housed corrupt government officials. Prison records indicated that he had been attacked 3 times by inmates who had been victimized by police officers, confirming the dangers faced by law enforcement officers who became federal prisoners. His appeals had been denied by every court, including the Supreme Court, which refused to hear his case. Legal experts noted that Thompson's conviction was so clear-cut and the evidence so overwhelming that no appellate court was willing to question federal prosecutors' handling of the case. Judge Washington continued her work on police reform through her position on the Federal Advisory Committee, helping to implement the accountability mechanisms that would prevent future Derek Thompsons from operating with impunity. Her recommendations were being implemented in law enforcement agencies across the country. The transformation was visible in crime statistics, community relations, and officer behavior. The police department that had once protected Derek Thompson was now recognized as a national model for constitutional law enforcement, with community trust ratings that were the highest in the region. Dr. Sarah Martinez, the federal monitor who had overseen the department's transformation, published a comprehensive report documenting the changes. Excessive force complaints had decreased by 78%, citizen complaints had dropped by 65%, and officer satisfaction with their work had increased by 43% as they were freed from the culture of corruption that had previously defined their profession. The financial impact of the reforms was equally significant. The city's insurance costs for police misconduct had decreased by 60% as the number of lawsuits declined dramatically. Federal funding for community policing programs had increased by $12 million as the department demonstrated its commitment to constitutional law enforcement. Thompson's former colleagues who had cooperated with federal investigators were completing their sentences and attempting to rebuild their lives. Some had found employment in private security, others had left law enforcement entirely. All carried the permanent stigma of their association with Thompson's crimes. Detective Rodriguez, now Sergeant Rodriguez, had become a national spokesperson for police reform. She testified before Congress, spoke at police academies, and consulted with departments across the country on implementing accountability measures. The Thompson case taught us that silence in the face of corruption is complicity, Rodriguez said at a national conference on police reform. We have a duty to speak up when we see misconduct, regardless of the personal cost. The ripple effects of Thompson's assault on Judge Washington were being felt throughout American law enforcement. Police chiefs were implementing new oversight mechanisms, prosecutors were taking civil rights violations more seriously, and federal agencies were dedicating more resources to investigating police misconduct. Judge Washington's final words at the Senate hearing captured the lasting significance of her encounter with Derek Thompson. What began as one man's racist assault has become a catalyst for constitutional transformation. We have proven that our system of justice, properly applied, can protect the vulnerable, hold the powerful accountable, and ensure that badge and uniform serve the Constitution rather than corrupt those who wear them. What she did next inspired an entire nation. The legacy of Judge Washington's encounter with Derek Thompson extended far beyond criminal prosecutions and federal oversight. Her response to the assault had inspired a new generation of civil rights advocates, judicial reformers, and police accountability activists who understood that individual courage could create systemic change. Law schools across the country were teaching the Thompson case as an example of how federal judicial authority could be used to protect constitutional rights and expose institutional corruption. Judge Washington herself had become a frequent lecturer, sharing her experience with future lawyers and judges who would carry forward the work of police reform. The Thompson case represents more than just individual justice, Judge Washington told students at Harvard Law School. It demonstrates how our constitutional system, when properly activated, can transform institutions that have resisted accountability for decades. OISTER, the Federal Police Accountability Act, had been implemented in over 3,000 law enforcement agencies nationwide, creating a standardized system of oversight that prevented the kind of corruption that had protected Thompson for 18 years. Early results were promising. Complaints of excessive force had decreased by 45% nationally, and citizen satisfaction with police services had increased by 38%. Thompson himself had become a cautionary tale, studied in police academies and law enforcement training programs. His case was used to illustrate how unchecked power, systematic bias, and institutional protection could destroy both individual officers and entire departments. Prison counselors reported that Thompson had struggled with severe depression and anxiety since beginning his sentence. He had participated in rehabilitation programs focused on understanding the impact of his crimes on victims and communities, though psychologists noted that he continued to show signs of denial about the extent of his misconduct. His children, now adults, had legally changed their last names and publicly denounced their father's actions. Their statements to the media reflected the profound impact of Thompson's crimes on his own family. We stand with the victims of our father's abuse and support the reforms that will prevent other families from experiencing what ours has endured. The financial settlements resulting from Thompson's crimes had funded community programs designed to repair the damage caused by decades of police misconduct. Victim compensation funds, youth development programs, and community policing initiatives had been established using money recovered through federal forfeiture proceedings. Maria Rodriguez's son, now a sophomore in college, had written an essay about his experience with Thompson that was published in the New York Times and read by millions of Americans. His account of surviving police brutality and finding healing through justice had become one of the most shared articles in the newspaper's history. "Judge Washington didn't just save me from Chief Thompson," the young man wrote. "She saved thousands of other young people who will never have to experience what I went through, because the system that protected him has been dismantled." The international community had taken notice of the Thompson case as well. Human rights organizations used it as an example of how democratic institutions could respond to police misconduct, and several countries had implemented similar oversight mechanisms based on the American model. Judge Washington had received invitations to speak at international conferences on judicial independence and police accountability. Her influence extended beyond American borders, as other nations struggled with similar challenges of law enforcement corruption and institutional accountability. The police department that had once employed Thompson had undergone such comprehensive transformation that it was now considered a model for constitutional law enforcement. Officers who had once feared reporting misconduct now served as training instructors for other departments seeking to implement similar reforms. Commissioner Hayes, who had survived the federal investigation and implemented the required reforms, reflected on the transformation. "The Thompson case forced us to confront uncomfortable truths about our institution. The changes were painful, but they made us better officers and better servants of our community." Judge Washington's work on police reform had earned her consideration for appointment to the Supreme Court, though she had indicated her preference to continue her current work on institutional reform. Her influence on American law enforcement would likely extend for decades through the officers trained under the new accountability systems and the precedents established through the Thompson prosecution. The most recent statistics showed that police departments under federal oversight had experienced significant improvements in community relations, officer performance, and constitutional compliance. The investment in reform had proven worthwhile, with decreased litigation costs, improved public safety outcomes, and enhanced officer morale. Thompson's case had also inspired legislative reforms at the state level. Michigan had passed the most comprehensive police accountability law in the nation, requiring independent investigation of all use-of-force incidents and establishing civilian oversight boards with subpoena power. As Judge Washington concluded her final congressional testimony on police reform, "Derek Thompson thought he could assault me with impunity because he had spent 18 years assaulting others without consequences. Instead, he learned that some people hold power he never imagined, and disrespecting them carries consequences that will follow him for the rest of his life. But more importantly, his crime became an opportunity to prove that our constitutional system, properly applied, can protect the vulnerable and transform institutions that have lost their way. And that's how one moment of racist aggression against a federal judge destroyed an 18-year career, exposed systematic corruption, triggered comprehensive reform, and proved that in America, no one, absolutely no one, is above the law." Derek Thompson thought he could assault Judge Washington with impunity. Instead, he learned that some people hold power he never imagined, and disrespecting them carries consequences that will follow him for the rest of his life. Thank you to everyone who typed justice in the comments and engaged with this incredible story of courage, triumphing over corruption. Your support proves that stories of dignity and accountability matter, and that together we can stand against injustice wherever it appears. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more tales of transformation, where the powerless find their strength and the powerful learn that no one is above the law. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is simply refusing to back down.